Well, good morning. Before the presentation of Professor Amalia Amaya, I would like to say that I am very happy to chair this session this morning, at least for 3 reasons. One, the first is I was the first full professor in this university 22 years ago. We are younger and happy at that moment, and that's all times, all happy times. And second, because I am also the co-director with Professor Jordi Ferrer and the connection, Brazilian connection, Professor Adrián Esgarbi, director of the collection of the series of law, philosophy and law in Marcial Pons, and I am very happy to overcome 100 books in this series. And I am very happy. And third, for the invitation of Jordi Ferrer. Jordi Ferrer is not only a very great legal philosopher, but also an entrepreneur and an innovator, a magician of the legal philosophy. And in this sense, I am very happy for the reason. Well, this second session is Professor Amalia Amaya. Professor Amalia Amaya is a researcher at the Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Amalia is PhD in the European University in Florence and also in Harvard, and is author of a lot of very interesting papers, for instance, applying virtue epistemology to questions of legal epistemology, and I like this field of Amalia, and has an important book of legal argumentation with a very nice title, The Tapestry of Reason, an inquiry into the nature of coherence and its role in legal argument. And this evokes to me, and I strongly recommend a visit in Girona, the best, in my view, tapestry never I have seen. That's the tapestry of decreation in the Cathedral of Girona, a tapestry from 11th century, really 11th century, really marvelous, really wonderful, combining, I don't know, ingenuity with deepness in a very convenient way. And I recommend a visit of if this Congress, very demanding, allows you the visit, I strongly recommend the visit to the tapestry. And I am passing the floor to Amalia. Amalia, when you want.
Bueno, pues antes de comenzar, muchas gracias
Before I begin, thank you very much to the organizers of the conference for this absolutely fantastic meeting, this international meeting. When I was studying law in Alicante during my first undergraduate year in philosophy of law classes, I was kind of curious about this evidential legal reasoning. So many years have gone by, always too many years go by, too many years have gone by since I studied in Alicante. But however, the change which this conference entails is spectacular. And honestly, my congratulations to the organizers. It's great. It really is a pleasure to be here and participating in this. Well, the subject of my presentation is the role played by deliberative virtues in collective deliberation. When typically most of publications on legal epistemology adopt this individual standpoint that focuses for its analysis on the individual and how the judge or the member of the jury, in those systems in which we have a jury, actually make up or justify their beliefs about facts that are being litigated. However, a huge amount of the factual determinations in the scope or in the field of law are carried out by groups, not by a single isolated individual, but rather by, in many legal systems, by collegiate courts and, of course, by juries in many different judicial systems. So I think it's important to take this dimension into account, this collective dimension of the determination and the deliberation about facts in law. The problem is that one really doesn't know where to go to find references, and the reasons are simple. In epistemology, generally not only in legal epistemology, the approach or the standpoint is also kind of individual, although there has been social epistemology developing in recent years, but this standpoint or approach has seen or studied the traits of character of individuals deliberating in a whole set for this to be a genuine, effective deliberation, but they've tended to focus on other aspects, such as, for example, problems of witnesses. Yeah, this is one of the central problems in social epistemology. But the standpoint I would like to use in order to be able to get close to what the role is played by virtues within the context of collective deliberations is epistemology of virtue. But here we don't find a reflection on the individual traits necessary that facilitate a successful collective deliberation, but rather the interest in those who have applied epistemologies of virtue to the discipline of social epistemology have been, and especially in law, determining whether it is possible to attribute individual character traits to groups. So how we can say, for example, the jury was impartial, the jury was brave. Yeah, this has been the kind of subjects that have been very much in the center of the interest of those who try to apply theory of virtue to the discipline of social legal epistemology. But what I'm interested in here is not on whether we can say that the tribunal or the jury was impartial, but rather what are those character traits or virtues that have to be possessed by individuals in order to deliberate in a genuine, effective manner collectively. Yeah? So, as in epistemology, we don't really, well, this has not really been worked on much at all, and we haven't worked all that much on theory of virtue either. We have to go to other disciplines. Fortunately, it is something that, yes, has been worked on in political science, most especially in political philosophy, in theories of deliberative democracy on the one hand, and this has been tackled also in communicative ethics, in theory of communication, especially in those researches that explore the ethical dimensions of communication. And it's also been, well, the issue has been tackled of what are the individual traits necessary in order to guarantee successful collective deliberation in theory of argumentation, not legal argumentation theory. I know that many of you are experts, but rather theory of argumentation in its widest sense. So my goal in this presentation is to start, and for me it's something very new, to start a quest or research to see in what way these disciplines that are not really, well, they're not disciplines neither legally or epistemologically, but how can they actually enlighten something about the problem of what kind of character traits or what virtues would be those facilitating successful collective deliberation. And I'm going to do it as follows. First of all, what I'm going to try to do is give a preliminary idea as to what I believe are the kinds of virtues that one could expect from members of collegiate juries and members of tribunals. Then I will suggest some reasons why I think that these virtues are valuable. So reasons on the basis of which the fact of possessing them and putting them into practice in collective deliberation facilitates good collective deliberation. And after that, I'm going to suggest that as well as this positive function or this positive justification of why these character traits have to be conceived as virtues in the context of collective deliberation, I am going to also suggest that they have a corrective role in certain problems that have been mentioned in social psychology, especially about what or in what way collective deliberation stops working, and what are the reasons that explain that sometimes group deliberations are even worse than individual deliberations. So what I will suggest is that this also helps us correct some of these distortions of deliberation. And I shall conclude with a very brief discussion on what are the implications of introducing an arithmetic-based consideration in collective deliberation in the legal dimension for public policies and for institutional design. Okay, so let me go first to what deliberative virtues are, what my suggestion is to what should be considered as deliberative virtues in legal epistemology. Well, first of all, and for those of you who might not be, well, used to dealing with the idea of virtue, I mean, we all have some intuition about virtue, but maybe I should say more about what do I think about virtue, because there are different conceptions in the literature. So my idea is based on an Aristotle idea of virtue, according to which virtue is the perfect means between two vicious extremes, one for defect and another excess. So for example, the virtue of bravery is the perfect medium between being excessively too much temerity or cowardice. And this point of balance is virtue according to Aristotle, and it's a personal quality. So, I mean, children are not virtuous according to Aristotle. One has to be educated and trained, and one has to get to the second nature of virtue. So, on the basis of this Aristotle idea of virtue, then, what are, for me, the traits of character that are virtues in those individuals that are participating in the context of collective deliberation in order to determine fact, both in collegiate tribunals and juries? I'm not going to give you an exhaustive list, but rather I'm going to give you some of the categories, okay? So not a long, long inventory. I would never get to tell them all. First thing we should have clear is what is the criterion or criteria we will use, and that, following Aristotle as well, the criterion I will use to determine what those character traits are that are virtues in deliberative practice is a teleological criterion. What are the ends of collective deliberation? And this will give me the criterion to establish a difference of character traits between deliberative traits and those that are not. So the main role of collective deliberation on fact in law is the determination of judgments about facts that are true, right? But not only this. The idea is to get to judgments about facts that are true by means of a rational process. Not just throwing a coin up in the air or, I don't know, going to the oracle. The idea is to have some kind of rational process that will make it possible for us to determine the truth of fact. So, virtues then have to be those character traits that will help us carry out or attain this goal. And generally speaking, when people talk about group dynamics, well, we talk about synergies. Understanding synergies in that a group has synergy when it functions correctly. And this has a lot to do both with the result as with the process itself. So when the desired result is obtained through the adequate process, then we say that, yes, there is positive synergy in a group. So deliberative virtues are those character traits that increase group synergy. They are traits of character that help and aid and abet groups to function from an epistemic point of view in attaining and also through exchanging opinions adequately. Well, they are traits that increase the synergy and make it possible for these groups to function better than the individuals of the groups separately. When a group has synergy, not only do we see that there is an aggregation of the information belonging to each member of the group, but rather the adding up is more than the adding of the parts, yeah? In the cases of optimum synergy, what obtains results that are much, much better than what would be achieved individually, and better even than what would result from simply aggregating or adding the information of each one of the members of that group. So then, what are these character traits that increase group synergy? First of all, and this is important both in the domain of law, of process and result, obtain true beliefs through a process of opinion exchange. First of all, of course, epistemic virtues, yeah? Virtues such as intellectual honesty, intellectual autonomy, being impartial, intellectual sobriety. These are some of the virtues or character traits, also intellectual bravery, that generate a deliberative environment that is propitious for this synergy, this positive synergy to occur. Second, we would have to establish a difference of a second group of deliberative virtues that are moral virtues. And maybe the connection here is not so evident. Virtues such as being civil. This is, funnily enough, very fashionable now in ethics of communication. I think that very recently we have all been witnessing, well, not specifically here in Catalonia, but at least in Twitter, we've been seeing how this part of kindness and being civilized and polite in recent years has really been disappearing, especially among, well, Twitters. And there's an interest in exploring this virtue. So then affinity, kindness, respect, mutual respect, virtues as well, such as being cooperative, this is essential, or to being temperate. These are moral virtues that are essential for a group deliberation to function properly. And they are essential not so much because they have a direct influence on results, but because they generate a deliberation atmosphere in which everything is much more propitious for people to feel better, more confident, and, well, so that they can give the information they have and make it available to the group, for the people to feel comfortable in order to point out minority opinions, to have an acceptance of positive and negative criticism. And in this sense, they all indirectly favor group deliberation. Thirdly, there is a set or group of virtues that are important, and as well as the epistemic and moral virtues, and they are argumentative virtues. Argumentative virtues such as being ready to listen to other people, being ready to modify one's own position on the basis of argument has been hearing and listening to, and also the position to question what is obvious are some of these traits that are virtues within the context of collective negotiation. And finally, as deliberation is not only an argumentative practice, but it's also a communicative practice, and this, of course, applies to any group deliberative context, not only to the determination of fact in law. Well, there is also a set of virtues that are the virtues of communication that are absolutely essential for the good functioning of groups when they are deliberating about any subject, and more specifically on how facts in law have to be argued. And these are virtues such as clarity, receptiveness, and they are essential virtues in this context of collective determination of fact. When I establish differences between these set of values, I'm doing it on the basis of clarity and analytics. I want to leave it very clear what the set of virtues is for groups to function properly, but we should see that there are quite intense and important relations between different virtues. Having an open mind is an intellectual virtue, for example, but it has moral implications, because when there is open-mindedness, of course, it's easier to advance in knowledge because one is ready to question one's own views and one is ready to accept other arguments and to listen to what others have to say. And this has a moral value in that culturally, I'm not going to be marginating ex ante minority attitudes, and I'm going to make sure that all those involved in the deliberation give their points of view. And this, of course, has a moral value too. And the other way around, as I said, virtues, although they are moral virtues, also have an epistemic dimension. For example, kindness is a moral virtue, but it has an epistemic dimension in that it facilitates the quest for truth because it generates this deliberative atmosphere in which it is easier to have an exchange of opinions, people feel more comfortable. And this is something that beyond being something analytical about the connection between the different kinds of virtue, I think it's something we've all experienced, how you have epistemic benefits associated to moral virtues such as kindness or being civil. And the same thing happens with relations between communicative virtues and the other virtues, or epistemic virtues and argumentative virtues. For example, if one is humble intellectually, one will be more ready to listen, and that is an epistemic virtue, but listening to others is argumentative. So there are important links then between the different types of virtue, and what is essential is that when one is actually transferring the case of character that facilitates this argument within a group, one is trying to facilitate the conception of community virtue in which there will be different relationships between the different character traits, and where having certain character traits will make it easier or will make it possible to acquire other character traits and virtues. Now let me point out what the value would be of these deliberative virtues. Why do I think that they are virtues in the context of collective deliberation? First, there is an epistemic value, okay? Because there is an interesting thesis about the wisdom of the multitude that I mentioned without giving you the name. It's this idea that groups are better epistemic agents if they work well than individuals. But what's important is to know in what conditions these groups function well, okay? So that, yes, indeed, the epistemic results can be considered better than those results achieved by an isolated individual. And here we have a whole series of empirical studies, very interesting, about, for example, the composition of the group as regards gender, cognitive diversity, race. So in what sense this variation within the group, or this heterogeneity, is relevant for the groups to function properly and for this collective or mass wisdom to be achieved, and not for them to be groups that work worse than isolated individuals. And also the regulations that structure deliberation are important. For example, if one is looking for consensus or for the majority rule, that differs because that will dictate significantly sometimes how the deliberation must proceed or what the dynamic of the group will be. And my suggestion really is that the character of individuals is also another one of the conditions that has to be met for the groups to function well. When groups have and put into practice the character traits I have mentioned amongst others, there are greater chances that the collective deliberation will reach this wisdom, this collective wisdom. But as well as an epistemic value, these deliberative virtues also have a practical value. Why? Because when one is deliberating, especially in contexts in which one determines fact in law, for example, it's not really only looking for the truth in any possible way, but it has to be done through argumentative procedures. That means you have to manage disagreement. It means you have to know how to reach consensus. There is a practical goal of resolving the conflict through argumentative means that's at the very basis of any collective deliberation. It underlies everything. And my suggestion is that the traits that I mentioned are useful when managing this conflict and in order to achieve consensus. Obviously, if we think there is a cooperative environment because individuals are making this cooperation effort, if there is an opening to the ideas of others, all these dispositions will lead to good management of disagreement, and it will make consensus possible, or at least it will achieve reaching a goal by majority. And finally, and this is important, I believe, not only do these virtues have an epistemic value and a pragmatic value, but they also have a moral and political value. And in last instance, courts and juries are places for public deliberation. And what people expect is that they will reason on those problems that they have to work on in a way that will put into practice values that are seen as something that has to be protected, or at least those that constitute a democratic system. So to the extent that, on the one hand, as I said, these virtues facilitate the acquisition of determinations of true fact, yes, through exchanging reasons, well then, on the basis really that they are at the service of these two goals, well then in a certain way they are putting into practice values that we believe are important in democracy, such as not imposing regulatory consequences to those that have not de facto committed the offenses. And that also the decisions made are based on reasoning and that they come from argumentative exchange. But beyond this, as I said, these virtues facilitate the generation of a deliberative environment in which there is mutual respect, in which the different members of the group deal with each other as equals, in which there is a respect for minority positions, in which there is a cordiality and this equalitarian attitude. And in this sense, I think that they illustrate, if we had all these very highly virtuous individuals within one same group, well, what we would have is a deliberative situation that would illustrate the kind of deliberative enterprise that is the aspiration of what happens in public deliberation places on the one hand, and also the kind of social relations, equalitarian and based on mutual respect, that are the basis of democracy. And this is the reason why I think that these have a political and moral dimension that should never be hidden by the fact that they help us reach these epistemic and pragmatic goals that such virtues go for and that any collective deliberation wants to get to. What I would like to argue here now, and I'm not doing too well about time, I guess, but it's that not only do they fulfill this positive role. Up till now, I have said that these deliberative virtues make it possible for us to reach results that are epistemically valuable. They manage disagreement and achieve consensus and do so in a morally valuable way. But there's something else. They comply also a very good corrective negative role. Corrective what of? Of what one tends to talk about as deliberative distortions. Deliberative distortions happen when the groups don't work properly, when there is negative synergy instead of positive, when the group gets through group dynamics to decisions worse than those that would have been made by the individuals of the group individually, and of course worse as well than what would have been achieved by adding up the different individual judgments. So these happen because of through different ways, okay? There are different deliberative distortions. There are four that are very relevant. The first, amplification, and that is there is empirical evidence that these biases that we were talking about in the previous session of confirmation and others, cognitive, individual, become amplified in group deliberative contexts, and this amplification is one of the first forms in which collective deliberation cannot work properly. Second, homogenization. Goodness, it's very difficult to pronounce. Homogenization? Yes. What is it? Reducing variability within the group. And this happens on the basis of what we typically call the cascade effect. It's rather surprising. There is empirical evidence in that when somebody speaks first, others repeat what has been said already, even though they might not believe that, even though they might think that this first one has made a mistake. But this cascade effect reduces variability of opinions within the group. There is also another route towards a towards a group being more homogeneous than it should be on the basis of the opinions of the members of the group, and that is what is called the common knowledge effect. and that is information or arguments or reasons that are widely shared by the group actually displace idiosyncratic or minority positions. There's also polarization, which is the idea that, and it's another way in which groups don't function well, when groups make people even more extreme than they were even before they start deliberating. So having a position that's more or less moderate, but the result of the group deliberation is instead of reaching consensus, what happens is that it polarizes all the individual positions, making everybody more extremist, yeah, as a result of the deliberation. And finally, number 4, domination, which is highly interesting and even more in a legal context, situations in which the tendency is towards the vision of the majority because minority voices are suppressed and the social disadvantage or drawback is seen in a lack of participation on behalf of those minority members or a lack of credibility on behalf of the minority position by those that sustain the majority position. There are 2 reasons, and here I follow Husty and Sam Stein in a great book, Wiser. 2 reasons that explain these phenomena. First reason, informational type effects, by which when people are in a minority position, they believe that they are wrong. Well, if everybody says A and I say B, I'm wrong. How can I be the only one that possesses the truth? But there are also causes that are social influences in which the reason why people tend to remain silent and not to express their opinion is not so much because they think that they're wrong, but rather because they're scared of social negative opinions, yeah? And so, well, that's what lies behind all these deliberative distortions. And my suggestion is that deliberative virtues help avoid or prevent these problems in which consensus is not reached, for example, in this case of polarization, yeah, that leads to those juries where there is no resolution or problems of management within collegiate tribunals, or it is reached in a pernicious manner, such as homogenization and domination. So how do these virtues help? Well, do I have 2 minutes? 5 minutes? First of all, they help by attenuating individual cognitive errors. And here I have to separate a bit from Professor Zuckerman, I'm afraid, because, yeah, I think it's been very persuasively argumented that cultivating these mental habits, these virtues, yes, helps, in fact, to correct, to a certain extent, the individual biases. And in this sense, if these biases are corrected, well, then we'll have less amplification problems, obviously. And furthermore, we're going to be able to prevent other problems. Experimental reasons based on experiments in cognitive sciences as to the fact that in some cases, individual cognitive actually aggravate some of the group deliberative distortions. So if we remedy individual cognitive biases, we are, in a way, working or trying to make sure that the deliberative group distortions are not as bad. And this happens especially with polarization. But there is more. I think that deliberative virtues attack the 2 sources of deliberative distortions. Informational, because if one has a certain intellectual autonomy, you're not going to only follow what most people say or what was said before. And social, because if we have minority members with a certain doses of intellectual and moral bravery, if there is a cooperative, kind environment where people are ready to listen to others, well, then these social sources that induce deliberative distortions will be reduced to a minimum expression. But they also they tackle specific problems that occur in each one of these distortions, such as, for example, in the cases of cascades. Yeah, I mean, there's a certain intellectual vitality. Well, then, how am I going to sustain what I said before? I'm going to be more inquisitorial. I'm going to be, formulating my own conceptions as to the case. Or in cases of polarization, one might think about being temperate or cautious as essential virtues, so that in these cases one doesn't go to the extreme. Well, coming now to an end of my presentation, I think we have to pay attention to social dimensions of knowledge, and epistemology of virtue can be a standpoint that is attractive. Some of these problems, and more specifically the problem of collective deliberation. And it has been sustained that there are different types of virtues, okay, that have a series of virtues, epistemic, moral, argumentative, and communicative, that fulfill epistemic values, ethical, political, and pragmatic. And furthermore, it is a solution, although partial, to deliberative distortions. And I want to end by pointing out that this is not idealism. It's not, I'm not being utopic. It's not, oh, I've come along here to talk about us all being virtuous. The world would be a better place, I'm sure. But it's not just idealism. No, it has practical implications for politics and important implications for institutional design. It has implications for public policies in education, of course. Maybe we should rethink about general education if we want to have juries that work adequately. And so we could generate opportunities for students everywhere to be able to use their deliberative virtues and to interact in environments where we can promote such character traits, and also legal training, of course. And as regards institutional design, it's important to think as well about the fact that even when one doesn't develop to the hilt, to the maximum, these virtues, the institutions can be designed in such a way that they propitiate the analysis, the virtuous analysis of evidence and collective virtue. So institutions can be designed, for example, we could think about how to give instructions to the juror with an empirical basis, and to consider, for example, that what is opposed is true. Because if we tell them to be impartial, that has no effect because they believe that they are anyway. But if we say, consider anything opposing what you think will be right, that is a way in which you are facilitating or making it possible for people to actually put all these virtues into practice. And in this sense, then, it would be interesting to rethink how the deliberative environment can be structured, the atmosphere of deliberation, silly things of having a round table or rectangular table like the one here. We all have experience of how a round table makes us all more open to listening to others instead of having a hierarchy in the physical space. So even designing tables and the design of what the standards and regulations will be that will structure the deliberation and will facilitate the putting into practice of these character traits that I think are very valuable in context of collective deliberation, and most especially in the determination, collective determination of facts in law. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Amalia. Perfecto. El tiempo tenemos.
Thank you, Amalia. Fantastic. We have half an hour again. We have half an hour for any questions, suggestions. In the center, we have someone, I believe, over here. Yes, I know you. Okay. Microphones, please, for translation. 3 or 4 over there. First of all, over here, in the center.
Gracias. Debo felicitarla.
Thank you. I have to congratulate you and our British professor, Dr. Zuckerman, because there are coincidences in the two versions. Essentially, I would like to ask you, although you didn't say it in prose or in words, but implicitly in your message, there is a suggestion for those deliberative virtues to be fundamental in order to actually become positive moral regulations that would be useful to prevent distortion in deliberation, specifically in collective justice organs. Yeah, collegiate. So specifically, when our British Dr. Zuckerman was talking this morning, and that's where I see the coincidence, he said that, well, in the message, of course, part of it was to prevent situations of bias that occur outside of the regulated environment, because they exist and they are real, although they are not included within the law, yeah, within the, so then maybe in deliberation with virtues, this could prevent that. So going from moral regulations to positive regulations. And that way, maybe, let me give you an example. I was talking with Professor Parra from Colombia, who's here with us. Many cases of a judge who makes a decision, no, sorry, of the magistrate or the member of a collegiate tribunal that makes a decision of the colleague in the court, or of the wife or the son or the relatives of colleagues, and making the decision, and so emitting or issuing a judgment totally influenced by a bias, whatever the denomination. So my question, don't you think then that it should be acknowledging the moral rule that is not written, but that we all acknowledge exists? So elevate it to positive dogma, this moral rule, shouldn't we do that? Better one by one if you want. So please try and make the questions brief. Listen, I'm not arguing that moral rules as such should be made positive. But rather, when I talk about having an institutional design that propitiates this virtuous analysis of evidence, I'm thinking more about these strategies that are called, Natch in English, what is it in Spanish? The translation is of pushing. Yes, pushing. Yeah, I don't know whether anybody has a better translation for this. Yeah, yeah, but that's the way we call it. Yeah, the theory of pushing forward. Anyway, yeah. So the idea then is that even without the individuals realizing, well, we are facilitating the fact that they can behave in a virtuous manner, morally speaking, of course, in contexts of group deliberation. For example, when you know that there's a certain tendency, as is known, and most of us tend to be dogmatic, yeah, I mean, this is a bias, if you like, so then maybe what there is there, what we could do is, well, get people to try and go to the extreme of dogmatism, because that's also a vice, yes, according to Aristotle's doctrine, but with the idea that doing that, you are going to get precisely to the fair medium, or systems that should not even be based on virtues, but that in a certain way do make it possible to solve these deliberative distortions. For example, the Delphi method, yeah, where we ask everyone, first of all, write what your opinion is about the case, in order to avoid this influence of the previous opinions, yeah? And in that way, one is achieving a kind of judgment autonomy, or intellectual autonomy, or judgment independence, to call it some way. So although it's not genuine, because it doesn't spontaneously come from having had that, you know, that trait transmitted right from birth, but in a way, yes, action is done on the basis of a virtue. So it's not so much positivizing morale, but I mean, listen, I have no problem at all with linking this intimately. I have done so much more than many of my colleagues, law and morale, but I mean, it's not really direct positivizing. Professor Pérez Bermejo. His microphone, please. Yeah. After, we'll go over here. There are 3 or 4 words, yes, and then up to the top. Please. Well, congratulations for your presentation. Very, well, food for thought, very interesting. I have a first problem with the label of virtue epistemologies in general, yeah? To summarize, how do you prevent the fact that then we will attribute knowledge to someone who finds the correct solution by serendipity, randomly, so knowledge by lack, yeah? I can be, I don't know, somebody, a tarot card guy, a mage, and with really lucky, I don't know. So I think that with this label, it doesn't really avoid it, because it's very consequentialist thinking, isn't it? Okay, I'm virtuous if I know how to do something. Nobody is even demanding that I express things propositionally, yes? How do I prove this knowledge? In the same way as I'm not able to explain to someone that doesn't know how to ride a bicycle, how I do ride a bicycle. So from this strongly consequentialist approach, I don't think, of course, you can prevent attributing knowledge to someone who, in fact, finds the correct answer just through serendipity. I mean, there's no, in the reliabilist responsibilist Aristotelian that has been put forward here. Then second, I'll try and be kind of like, you know, go tweeting to be summarizing. Yes, well, no, maybe not tweets, but do be brief, please. Yeah, well, I do have problems as well with dialogic or deliberative virtues, because isn't there something circular to talk about deliberative and dialogical virtues when in fact dialogue and deliberation is a precondition in order to acquire virtue? This is something that is quite explicit even in MacIntyre, because, yeah, I mean, how do we acquire virtue? Well, we do so. How? Through practice and imitation of models. Fine, all very nice, but he also acknowledges that in moral practices there has to exist dialogue and the possibility of exerting criticism. So if we're talking about imitating models, there is another model and another problem, and that is whether this is not taking us to a very hierarchical vision of things. Because yes, of course, virtues include models of excellence, standards of excellence, and imitation of models. So isn't that contradicting elemental assumptions of what we do, such as everybody has the right to talk, everybody has the right to act, so against equity then, yeah? And my third mistrust has to do with the label of the wisdom of the crowds, yeah? I mean, or the more the merrier, as they say in English. I mean, the more we are, the better, the more the merrier. Well, empirically, well, I guess that you have read much more than I have about group thinking, of course, but there are empirical studies that say exactly the contrary. That is, that the larger the group, the more you see the reproduction of the tendency that there are a few that do everything and a majority does nothing at all. And you will say to me, oh, but you're giving me pathological examples of what should never be group deliberation. Well, fine, but from the legal point of view, the contrary happens as well. If we make these dialogues and deliberation become a rule, the consequence is that it will be irrelevant how many more people there are in every group. And if we come close to be perceptual, logical, perfect machines, well, then it will be completely irrelevant to add any more machines. The typical example is the original position of roles, right? I mean, the deliberative position that's more rigid, which one, in fact, can do well alone. That's all. Thank you. Well, so many things, huh? So be as brief as possible. If not, I'll just send you down. Well, briefly, yeah. Thank you. Very interesting, these questionings. I'll just give you an overview about this serendipity thing. Well, listen, it's a problem for any theory. It's not really a specific problem of theories of virtue. It's just a problem for any theory. So my welcome to anybody coming along to solve this random or serendipity issue. I mean, in the case of luck, when somebody is very fortunate and finds the truth kind of spontaneously because there's a special intuition, or I can't even give reasons for that, but in any case, it's not done through knowledge, and we require this component of justification, which is a component that constitutes knowledge as a true and justified belief. But furthermore, I would like to think that following this avenue, when one defends that virtue is something else than only intuition or being kind of fortunate, yeah, well, there is a relevant model, and I guess this is what you were thinking of, that assimilates the virtuous person with the person that has a privileged moral intuition in such a way that the virtuous person sees what has to be done. The virtuous judge sees how the case has to be solved, and it's an intuition that doesn't admit discursive justification. So this is not the concept of virtue that I think is more adequate in general, and certainly not in the case of law. I would be more interested in developing an idea of virtue as a knowledge of experts. Well, analogous to expert knowledge, yeah? So analogous to expert knowledge, in which the virtuous person is not only the person that has this ability to solve problems that for other people are very complicated and see what the solution is, but that can give you the reasons why. Take an expert in wine, saying this wine is better than that one, and you say why, and the person says, I don't know. Well, then we stop thinking he or she's an expert. Or in a lab, when you say, why do I have to take the sample out now? Why don't I wait 24 hours? And they say, I don't know, it's just this way. That person is not an expert any longer, and it's not a model of virtue. The expert is a person that has the ability to give reasons, explaining judgments, although these judgments have not been the base of a reflection, but rather to a high extent, especially in easy cases, are really direct, the end result of trained reasoning. But in these deliberative actions, in this circularity you mentioned, listen, dialogue is necessary for the virtues to be acquired, but I think, let's see, the two typical ways to acquire virtue are, yes, indeed, habit on the one hand, and model imitation on the other. These are the two classical ways. I like a lot the idea that, yes, the dialogue, the context or environment of discussion is important for that to happen. I like it, but even that doesn't go for circular discussion, because I have to be able to be in this context in order to acquire the virtues that later on in a context, for example, when I'm part of a jury, I will be able to develop. Yeah, if not, it would be a virtuous circle, wouldn't it? In fact, in this idea of, well, of education, yeah, in order to make virtuous citizens and virtuous legal experts, well, the opportunity is to have a curriculum where they can practice those group deliberative aptitudes. Yeah, I mean, that not when the members of a jury is not the first time that they have to have deliberative group action, but to be able to practice before that. And so maybe it would be good that in education this were made possible, that one can start practicing this kind of group deliberation. Regarding models of excellence, well, I don't think it's hierarchical. I don't really think it's all that hierarchical or that it goes against equity, because one thing is to say that we all have the same moral value, but something different is not to acknowledge the fact that there are some people who do know more and that are kind of, you know, they outperform others, and they, to that extent, they are models. And it doesn't have to be hierarchical, because they don't have to be total models. Partial virtue models are models we can learn from, and we can learn a lot. And some can be models of one thing, and others can be models of something else. In fact, there are interesting studies in psychology that show that the ordinary common garden heroes, those that are not kind of saints, so to speak, or kind of non-qualified heroes, are better models as regards the development of virtue than those that are full virtue models, because they are more inspirational. It's kind of easier to emulate those heroes that we seem are closer to us, something that we can actually reach. Whereas it's much more difficult to try and be, you know, like someone that's so excellent that you'll never get there. So then they are more efficient models in that sense. And finally, this, the wisdom of multitudes, of the crowd. I have to acknowledge I should not have talked about the wisdom of the crowds. I shouldn't have, because not everything that is applied in large disciplines such as the wisdom of crowds is applicable to these small deliberation groups, yeah? Definitely. And what I was referring to is to small deliberation groups that have different group dynamics when compared to the wisdom of the crowds. But it was so pretty, I loved the expression wisdom of the crowds. But yes, I acknowledge there's a huge difference there in scale. You can't really go from one to the other. I mean, no, I mean, they're different. It's, you know, democracy of the crowds and small groups. No, it's not the same. To my left, topologically, not politically. To my left, 3 rounds of 3, please.
Please try to be brief. May I try to speak in Portuguese if I speak slowly? Thank you very much for your speech. When I read your speech, I think in the Federal Supreme Court from Brazil, and we have perceived that there has been a change, and many of the distortions that you have mentioned have taken place. I would like to ask you whether you imagine who will have the last word, and how can we control all distortions when there is when someone serves. So that could be part of the first question, because he's speaking Portuguese, so it's a little bit difficult to understand. But the second question would be, what's your opinion about deliberation and transparency? Transparency to verify the virtues and distortions. In Brazil, everything is deliberated publicly. And I don't think that's the case in other countries. So which is the better model, in your opinion? No, so many people, I mean, not that many people had asked the floor, so no way. I think there were 3 people that had really asked the floor. So please be honest. The 3 first people, the 3 first person that asked for the floor, because we have no time for more. Thank you very much. I would like to rebuild your thesis in order to ask 2 questions. If I'm not wrong, the idea is that deliberative virtues contribute to make better decisions or correct decisions. And so this would be a desirable result, to have this rational process of exchanges of opinions. If this is a good summary of your thesis, it's not clear to me whether these best or better decisions or correct decisions would be assured when these 2 conditions are real. So when we have these rules, rational rules, deliberative rules. Second questions, these rules would be any kind of set of rules, or would there be better and worse rules? And then third question, despite the fact that one could follow this procedure and we would be possibly in front of virtuous people, should we need a new analysis of the process? Could it be that the process would anyway be worse than expected? Thank you. A very precise and concise question. If the aim that you identify in the process from the point of view of evidence and confirmation of the truth, I have a concern. I cannot quite understand the presence of the taxonomy that you have mentioned, because I think this could be absent in a correct deliberative process. And so I think that very bad people could very well do this deliberative work that you were mentioning. Someone asked the floor here in this side. Thank you. I have another question, which is quite simple. You said that the deliberative virtues could be a good design for the process. I was wondering whether you have identified an institution working with these virtues, or which would be the virtues of an institution to work like this. Juan Carlos Bayón has the floor. But maybe Amaya can answer first. Concerning who would control the virtues in a court, Well, I'm not in favor of kind of police system controlling all what the workers and the civil workers are doing, civil servants are doing. I think that we should pay attention to the fact that some virtues are respected. And I think that's different from what you suggested. On the one hand, education is key, and this is my main interest, but there are also implications, of course, for selection when judges are chosen. So rather than controlling the virtues, which are already, I mean, within the people that are in court, we should think of the complexity of the selection process for judges. And so resolum, I mean, the person that has tried to find out the implications of the theory of virtues is key for the selection of judges, even in the Supreme Court. Concerning transparency, I cannot say really. I cannot tell, because in Mexico, I'm living in Mexico now, and there is also this debate all around transparency, and deliberations are broadcasted. Court deliberations are broadcasted, and I think it's, I mean, it's too complex, too difficult, how transparency has to be understood, and the fact that systems have to be more transparent. I have doubts, but I think that I would talk beyond what I really know, so I stay there. Concerning the rebuilding and the questions related, there are two conditions for virtuous people and the traction rules, iteration rules, and social rules. So, first of all, I believe that rules would not need to be necessary, because virtuous people are those people for whom rules can be interesting in order to acquire virtue, but by definition, they are the people that have the capacity to question the rules. And in that sense, we could really suppress one of the rules. I mean, there would be no need for rules to explain how they need to listen to others or how to question certain things, because that would be part of their inner self. So the question, if we suppress this part, is whether virtuous people could become normative standards in order to see whether a sentence is correct or not. And I would like to be able to argue that yes, even though I'm not really in the right position to do so. So I think it could be necessary to understand as Aristotle was saying, the moral virtues and the legal speech. Whether judges can be mistaken, yes, of course, because sometimes virtuous people do not agree, and if they do not agree, of course, they can be mistaken. So there is no guarantee for correction. I don't think that we can have this kind of ideal of the virtuous people. But I think that the McDowell solution is a right solution, an appealing solution, and we need to point out that when someone tries to apply the virtues in a legal reasoning, we do not need to commit to the fact that there is just one single fact that is correct or not. But the thesis would be, if there is a right reason, virtuous people would be able to see, to identify it. And I think that's a healthy solution among those people that can be virtuous people. Concerning whether moral virtues are relevant or irrelevant to find the truth, and whether bad people, evil people could, make a decision, I think you were the person asking that question. I think that, let's put it another way. I don't think that moral virtues are irrelevant because they have a direct impact in the deliberative environment. And if there is an exchange of reasons in that environment, where there is inference to fear, repression, shame, and there is an openness of mind by the people being there with kindness, mutual respect, etc. Even though in a direct play there won't be a systemic application, there will be a space in which the fact of having virtuous behaviors will be there, and that will lead to the truth. But not all virtues will be relevant. That is why some of them coming from communicative ethics will be relevant. And there is something that I'm not going to deal with, whether we need theory of the virtues, and that finally one cannot have the deliberative virtues without having the whole set of moral virtues and epistemic virtues. This is a very strong thesis, and of course there would be implications saying that evil people or bad people would not be able to properly deliberate in those surroundings. So we would need to see how to deal with this in a reasonable way. But of course, it's a thesis which is quite accepted, by the way.
Okay.
Professor Juan Carlos Bayón. Thank you for your presentation. I really found it extremely interesting. I have a question about what you said towards the end, about the institutional mechanisms that would actually foster these virtues and could make, well, these virtues go towards better results. Better results specifically when the deliberation is about fact, because this is something that in your presentation else entirely, but anyway, these are deliberations on fact. But at a given point in time, you said that as well as the importance of education, that's important for citizens in general that might eventually become a jury or judges specifically. Yes, education is important, but more directly and more immediately, you said that maybe one could instruct juries by not saying be impartial, because you said that would be useless, but you said telling them think that the other might be right. Listen, I don't see such a large difference between the fact that you think it wouldn't be useful or it would. I think that the two are quite similar about being impartial. But Professor Zuckerman, I can't find him now, but he was saying it before in his presentation, wasn't he, that some judges that were kind of working in rape cases would react because very much aware of the fact that they might have a bias that would lead them to kind of be harder. They tried to work against it, so then they committed the other bias. In these situations, this always happens, yes? So don't you be a victim of this bias, and then very possibly the effect of that, well, caution is that you are a victim of the contrary bias. So when somebody talks about institutional mechanisms in this sense, I think about mechanisms that operate differently. You refer to them a bit. And my question is, do you have any ideas, I mean, rules about the composition of the organs that have to deliberate, or about the procedure, the way in which the deliberation takes place? Because here I think the idea is that the mechanisms have to produce the effect in a way in which people are unaware. So they have to foster a result in a way that people are acting as though they were virtuous. It's not to educate them for them to be virtuous or telling them, do think about the fact that you have to be virtuous, but rather design a mechanism that indirectly obtains this result of virtue. It's like that civilizing force of hypocrisy, isn't it? It's not really telling people, be aware of the fact that you have to think of collective interest. No, no, no. It means to create an environment in which people will act as though they had virtues that possibly they don't have. So in this sense, and for an environment in which specifically decisions have to be made on fact and evidence, well, what kind of institutional mechanism do you think might be interesting? That we're not simply telling people, please make sure you decide well and that you are virtuous, because this, not only is it not useful, it has the contrary effect, as we've seen. Yes, up there.
Gracias, Amalia.
Thank you, Amalia. It's a pleasure to listen to you. So stimulating. I have three difficulties. I do agree with the substantial part of what you say, but there are three difficulties here. First, the ethics of virtue. Not really as to what you said, but as to the discussion. It has to do with the sense, first, of the virtue inventory or catalog. I mean, McIntyre said it, and it's going to have an incidence, because once you have the list of the relevant and non-relevant virtues, and you specify how they relate to each other, the consequence will be that these same virtues will foster deliberation, and then there will be kind of an effective performance. Second, other than the catalog, yeah, virtues have to do with limitations. All suggestions and, well, I don't know who've tried, I don't know, there are so many who've reflected on this and tried to take Habermas-type premises and assumptions to the context of the procedure itself, have had to face certain problems, because consensus and dialogue in the context of public space is different from the process itself, although there's a kind of deliberation, but there are space and time limitations. Also, there are kind of intuitional limitations too. Finally, third difficulty I see has to do with the fact that when one promotes an ethic of virtues, be it moral or epistemic virtues, one gets the impression that there is a kind of commitment towards a philosophy of politics that's not being made explicit. So maybe ethics of virtue fits in better with one type of philosophy of politics. In Republican, civil virtues are fostered for them to go along towards public deliberation. And your thesis is also committed to a political philosophy, Republican, for example? Thank you. Time for one question only. Let me clarify the first, the one of the catalog, the one of the list I didn't understand. Yeah. In McIntyre, well, it focuses on the fact that when you go to this neo-Aristotle interpretation and you have the reproduction of the importance of virtues, my question is, how long should the list of virtues to be fostered, how long should it be? And finally, what will their incidence be in the rules that will be transmitted later on? So when McIntyre is criticized, it's because, you know, what virtue do we foster, what virtue do we not foster? Because, of course, when you have public space, some virtues will be better for consensus. Yeah, time for one question. I give it to Professor Marina. Very briefly, congratulations, Amalia, because your presentation is seducing us all. I'm rather floored, because to act virtuously, I do agree with you. I guess anyone might agree. It's the best way to harmonize and to get to a solution. But I get the feeling when you were talking, as you made headway in your presentation, and also on the basis of many of the questions later on, I think we're losing our focus, yeah? That the decision that has to be made is a decision based on fact. What we want to achieve is a reconstruction in a true manner of facts that happened. So then that procedure, this epistemology of virtues, I don't really think it's thinking especially about fact, but rather it can be valid for just any procedure. So it loses focus of the fact that without a knowledge, without an information to assess the informations that are participating in the process and that are the elements with which the group or the tribunal or the court will have to deliberate, there's nothing doing. I'm thinking, for example, because I'll be talking about it this afternoon, I'm thinking about expert knowledge. When a group of people, a court, is facing an expert, who is bearing witness on something that none of the members of the court, let us imagine, has no idea or knows how to kind of value. Well, however virtuous, brave, open-minded, reflective, minority respectful the people are, well, it'll be very difficult for that ideal deliberation to guarantee a true resolution of the process. I do agree, however, with you in that a court, yes, indeed, it can be a better epistemic agent than a single individual, definitely. But because of this other reason, not because of they are virtuous, but rather simply it's a question of probability. What one does not know, the other might. And then you increase the possibilities of the group as a whole of carrying some knowledge that comes from informations of all. So it's a true decision. Thank you. Yes, the end with Amaya. Well, to Juan Carlos Bayón. Well, you think it's not so different. Listen, what's essential here is to use empirical studies, because very often the intuitions we have are not eventually confirmed by empirical studies. So specifically, the difference between, be impartial, and this was done in context of judicial decision-making, huh? Well, the difference with juries, not real, obviously, but that's, being a member of a jury. So the difference between the advice of be impartial and the advice of think about the other being right is there, but then the difference between those that were not given any instructions or cautions and those who were, I mean, sometimes the fact of saying be impartial didn't change anything in the results. That's what happened with the experiment. In order to be able to design what will work means that the virtue will be reached. And one has to use, different studies and see how we can get people to go towards virtue. I do agree with the procedural rules. I mean, I gave an example, but yes, indeed, one has to think about how procedural laws and the evidential rules structure everything, and that's essential in order to promote deliberation that comes close to a virtuous type deliberation. In fact, some exist already as rules of law. I mean, I don't know, when we talk about we're talking about this adversary procedure, I mean, then you're talking about being or not being impartial, right? And about the fact of that virtue not existing. There can be other institutional reforms that have more to do with the social environment. That is, how do we regulate social interaction between the jury and the judge, for example? Why not allow members of the jury to have a more kind of, direct discussion with the judge and let them ask questions when they don't understand? Because students can do it. I mean, really, one is frustrating the goals when members of the jury can't ask anything, because sometimes they don't understand things easily. So we should think not only of the rules that are strictly organizing the process, but those that also structure social interaction that takes place in this deliberative context. As to this catalog or list of virtues in McIntyre, well, I'm not so worried, frankly, because funnily enough, when you start seeing lists and catalogs of virtues, they don't differ all that much. I mean, you might think so at the beginning, but they don't. If you go review some of these texts that you read, especially in North America, of exemplary judges, from, ideological postures that are really quite different, well, the character traits that are considered admirable and the basis of which justify that these people are to be read about in books and magazines and journals are essentially, they overlap, don't they? Now, there you go, serendipity. I'm working on virtues of leaders of international organizations in international law. And I was quite surprised at the huge overlapping of virtues of leaders, political leaders of the Eastern and Western traditions. I don't mean by this that there are no cultural differences or that maybe some traits are to be seen more in one model and another. There will be differences, but the degree of overlapping is huge. What's more interesting maybe is to think about what virtue consists of, and not so much to fine-tune and have this very complete list that, as I said, I don't think is possible anyway. And concerning political philosophy, yes, of course it has implications in philosophy of politics, but I had to sum up because I didn't have enough time. Yes, there is a certain commitment, not with republicanism specifically, although yes, to a point it comes closer to this conception than others. But yes, when I talk about cultivating virtues of deliberation, those are civil virtues, really. And when I talk of moral virtues, generating this equalitarian attitude that makes it possible to see social relations in a democracy, well, yes, there I am asking for a kind of equalitarianism, yeah, I mean, equality, yes. So epistemology of virtue, yes, does take us to that kind of philosophy of virtue. And Marina, well, maybe let me clarify, because what I don't want to say, don't get me wrong, is that all that matters in ensuring that groups function and deliberate well is virtues. Not at all. Virtues are only one of the components. I was talking as well of the group composition, the fact that there should be cognitive diversity of the different members of the group. So this has to do with the fact that you're maximizing chances that those in a jury or in a court, well, there is always someone that has the knowledge needed for expert interpretation because they come from different backgrounds and with different even political and social beliefs. So when I was talking about the epistemic value in that it maximizes possibilities that the group has a positive synergy that will mean eventually true results that epistemically are valuable, well, those are deliberative virtues together with other criteria, such as the ones you mentioned. And furthermore, concerning how to correct these distortions of group deliberation, I mentioned it, maybe it was too quick, but I said that simply, this is just a partial solution. I'm not saying it's a total solution. As I said, there are methods. Some of them, Weiser talks about them in his book. Some methods that make it possible to mitigate the effects or distortions of deliberative distortions not based on virtues. For example, incentives. Yes, incentives. That's more difficult to apply in the legal courtrooms. But anyway, yeah, there are a number of suggestions as to how you could limit these negative effects of deliberative distortions that don't have this arete basis and that can be also useful with or as well as. And amongst them, well, if we think of social influences or the problem of domination, well, what these deliberative distortions allow is that beliefs of the minorities are not listened to or are kind of ignored or that they don't participate. That's because there is a basic social segregation that is being reflected in the context or environment of deliberation. And to tackle this, not only do you have to go for institutional design of the deliberation environment and of the probatory institutions, but rather it requires a degree of social integration that will only be achieved by means of kind of deeper social reforms. So this is only one part of the solution, an important part, but only one part. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Amalia.
Gracias.